me just say a couple words. Good morning. Yes. Good morning. I'm Bob Wiltenberg, Dean of University College, and it's again a pleasure to welcome you to this third in our series of lectures on tolerance and civic discourse, sponsored by the Master of Liberal Arts program. Those of you new to University College may want to know more about our programs and information about them, both the Masters and Doctors in Liberal Arts, as well as many others, available on the table here or on our website, ucollege.worcester.edu. And for those of you who've been here the past 2 weeks, may I draw your attention to something new on the table, which is a list of special audit courses available for summer. It looks like they've got quite a few of them across a wide range of subjects. I think you'll find something of interest there. Having in the past 2 weeks examined our topic from the perspectives of classics and law, we are fortunate to have with us this morning Alan Lambert from the Department of Psychology. Alan was educated at Cornell University and the University of Illinois and joined us here at Washington University in 1992. Professor Lambert is a leading personality and social psychologist with widely published work on social judgment and bias of many kinds, and his work has been recognized with, among others, Fulbright and National Science Foundation awards. He serves as editor of several journals in the field and is much in demand as a speaker, both nationally and abroad, in such places as England, Canada, Germany, Sweden, and Georgia, the country, not the state. On campus, well, maybe he's also well known in the state, I don't know for sure. On campus, he's also well known as a particularly dedicated and effective teacher and mentor for both undergraduate and graduate students. We're very happy to have him with us this morning speaking on the topic of the psychology of stereotypes, perception, and identity.
Well, thank you very much. All right. I think we're good. Thank you for the very kind introduction. So just to give you a heads up for today, I'm going to be speaking for about an hour, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Just wonder if we can get the lights down here, just control. Maybe medium, maybe. Oh, that's good. Oh, very nice, very cozy. In any event, I understand that you've been, I guess the idea here is to get a multidisciplinary perspective on these things, and I just want to sort of be emphasizing that although I like psychology, I like social psychology, it's not the only perspective. One needs to be modest about such things. So it's not like, here I'm going to deliver truth with a capital T, maybe a little truth with a small t, but just keep in mind that there's many ways of looking at things, and that includes what I'll be talking about today. Okay, great. Unless you want to, I don't think you, probably best to not to take notes. This is one of those talks that you'll probably get more out of it just sitting back and listening. But I just want to give you just a broad outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll give you some general observations about stereotyping and prejudice. I'd like to then morph over into basic issues of categorization. As you'll see, it's a running theme in my talk today, that stereotyping can be studied from a lot of different perspectives, but categorization is one fruitful and historical way of looking at that phenomenon. I'll be talking about things such as stereotyping. We normally think of stereotyping as negative, and indeed it often is, but it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. One can have stereotypes that are positive as well. We'll be talking about how do people feel about their own stereotypes. We all have them, including myself. And are there any cases in which stereotypes would seem appropriate from the person whose perspective of who's using them? Okay, we usually think of stereotypes as things that we should avoid, but then social psychologists are interested in asking the person who's using that stereotype, do they think it's appropriate? Even though from a larger perspective, we might say we shouldn't do that. This is sort of a classic issue, the when and why question. When do people stereotype, and why do they do that? And if everyone agrees that stereotyping is bad, then why does it still exist? Okay. Stereotype really fading. This is something that's an interesting issue, is that on a somewhat superficial level, we might say, well, things are not great now, but you might say, well, at least they're better than they were in the 1950s or 1940s. But I'm slightly pessimistic on that count, that it might seem that on the whole we're less prejudiced now than we used to be. Say Americans, there's a somewhat more pessimistic way of looking at that. And then finally be talking about automatic or implicit stereotyping, and then we'll open it up for questions. So what is this thing called stereotyping or prejudice? What is that? Well, it's a lot of different things, and it's an extremely complex phenomenon. Right? It can be studied from a lot of different perspectives. For example, historical perspectives. I don't know if any of you have been to the History Museum right off of Lindell, where they talk about, I mean, the focus is on the Civil War and slavery, but, you know, it's fairly obvious. You can understand, for example, history of stereotyping between whites and blacks in the United States as a function of this historical event called slavery, right? So historians would study stereotyping prejudice in the United States, at least, from the perspective of Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, things like that. If I were a historian, I would surely talk about that if I was talking about race relations in particular. Economic, right? So there's an economic approach to stereotyping prejudice. That is to say that between you have the haves and the have-nots, right? And economists study this, that when you have groups that have a lot of wealth and power and groups that don't have a lot of wealth and power, right? Or economically, you often get strife and conflicts between groups. That's sometimes called realistic conflict theory. That when you have a limited amount of resources, land, jobs, right? You often get competition between groups. Right, and that would be an economic, micro, as well as, a macroeconomic approach. But since I'm not an economist, I'm not going to be talking about that either. Biological, there's a long history of research, arguably beginning with Charles Darwin, extending well beyond before him, that, you know, human beings, like it or not, tend to be aggressive, or can be aggressive, and it serves a territorial function. Konrad Lorenz, famous biologist, talked about that we use aggression to secure and protect our resources, mates, lands, and resources. And so a lot of people said, well, biological basis for aggression, right? The aggressive urge in human beings could also be used to explain why we engage in stereotyping prejudice. And there's an anthropological approach as well, and I'll talk about that later. But since I'm a psychologist, I'll be talking about that approach, which tends to be a little bit more micro in its approach. I'll explain what I mean by that later. But the main thing I want to mention at this point is that all of these perspectives are valid in their own right. Just because I'm not talking about the historical approach doesn't mean it's not valid. It just means that I'm not a historian, and I'll leave it to my colleagues in the history department to speak of that. Now, when I was preparing this talk, I thought about bringing up this issue of the proverbial blind men and the elephant, right? So they're all blind and they're all touching the elephant, and one touches the legs and say it's a tree. The other one touches the trunk or the tusk and says it's a spear. The analogy isn't quite right? So we know it's an elephant, right? We're studying the beast, the elephant, or the beast or the elephant in this case is prejudice and stereotype. But we know what it is. We're not completely blind, but nonetheless, I did find an image where these scientists are not blind; they have their eyes open. Nonetheless, they're touching different parts of the beast, right? They're focusing on different parts of it, so that's a reasonably good analog for stereotype. We're touching or focusing on different aspects of this complex phenomenon and drawing conclusions, even though we recognize that other people are having different perspectives. Okay. Okay, that's what my colleague says. So enough throat clearing and hand waving. Let me get to the matters at hand. So one thing I want to mention at the onset is that human beings love to categorize. Period. They love to put the world into boxes and categories. We just love doing that. So if human beings were a department store, we'd be called categorizers are us. So if we were an action hero, we would be called the categorizer. If it didn't sound so stupid. So you might ask, well, why is it? Why is it that human beings love to categorize? Why do we love to put things into mental boxes? Right? The world doesn't really have mental boxes, but we love to do that. So we are indeed the categorizer. Well, one reason is that the world is fairly chaotic, complex, right? And we, human beings, this is a well-accepted principle, is that we might find chaotic nature sort of interesting in an academic sense, but, as human beings, we're we would like to strive towards more stability or sameness or stability in our sort of order. And if you want order, categories is what you want. Right? So if you want order, categories are what you want to order. So let's do just a little exercise here. So begin with the idea that evolutionary psychologists have argued that we, along with other species, generally sort the world into two categories. Now, that doesn't mean we literally think about this consciously, but we go through life sorting things into things that are dangerous, things that could eat us, things that could kill us, and things that are not dangerous. So it's this very evolutionary, advantageous distinction between dangerous things and non-dangerous things, right? So we go through the world, whether we are conscious of it or not, sorting our world into good things, non-dangerous things, and dangerous things. And if you didn't do that, odds are you would lose in the evolutionary sweepstakes, right? If you say, oh, what a nice little kitty, and it's a saber-toothed tiger, and you try to play with it and it eats you, your evolutionary journey is done, right? So just a little cheesy little PowerPoint, little animation here. And I see with this dog, I've done this purposely. Dogs are sort of in the gray area. Some dogs are very nice. Right? Some dogs are very dangerous, right? And this is sort of a real-world problem. You're knocking on somebody's door. You've never been there before. And there's a large German Shepherd. Is it dangerous or not dangerous? Well, if it was a little tiny little dachshund, you'd probably say, oh, probably not dangerous, although I got bit by a dachshund once, since that was sort of a bad guess on that part. But in general, things like dogs don't necessarily fit neatly into the dangerous versus non-dangerous category. And I'm choosing that specifically because I want to make this a larger point. It is true that we do attempt to categorize and sort our world. That doesn't mean that it's easy, and doesn't mean that everything is neatly sortable. We're trying to sort it, even though the categories don't apply so neatly to the world, right? So that's a general, very important point that I'll be making today. We want to categorize, even though the world resists neat categorization, right? And just to foreshadow a point, we use psychologically as well as linguistically, like words like black Americans and white Americans. I mean, what does that really mean, white Americans? So my ancestors were from England and Russia and Poland. Some of your ancestors may be from Sweden or England or Switzerland. Yet we're all categorized as belonging to the category of white, which is actually linguistically, biologically, and psychologically there is no such thing as race in a strict sense. And similarly, we use the word black to refer to people of African ancestry, of Caribbean ancestry. It's a useful category, but it has no biological or strict meaning. But we still use the term a lot. So that's sort of a running theme. Okay, since it's Saturday, let's just do another little thing, sort of food versus not food. So let's suppose you're stranded on a desert island with lots of things, and let's just suppose it has a McDonald's on the island. And you're sort of sorting the world into food and not food. Again, and you're walking around when McDonald's happens to be closed and you see these red berries. Are they food or not food? Right? Are they food or not food? Dangerous, not dangerous? Sometimes, it would be nice if you walked in the woods and had a little sign that says, don't touch this mushroom, it will kill you, or don't eat these berries, these are bad for you. But alas, the world doesn't have these signs, so we have to figure this out by trial and error. Okay, so I'm just using those examples, albeit silly examples, is that we do go through life sorting into categories. Again, I don't want to suggest that people walk through the woods and say, well, I need to now categorize everything on my hike today between dangerous, non-dangerous. It's happening probably unconsciously, right? It's not a conscious agenda setting necessarily. Okay. Now, those who have interest in philosophy and the classics realize that, psychologists have been hardly the first to recognize that people like to categorize, right? So Aristotle came up with his theory of the 5 classical elements. He argued that the world, the universe, can be usefully divided up into 5 basic, he would say categories, or elements, as he said. Now, Aristotle was a smart dude. He was on the right track. As you'll see, he got one thing wrong. But one thing he said, we can divide the world, the universe, into 5 elements: earth, mineral, fire, water, air, and then, at least the way this is usually translated, is the ether. Right? No, we don't mean the Ethernet. We mean the ether. And there. Can you hear me? Still hear me all right? Okay. So really, no one really knows what the ether is. As far as we know, you can't go outside, and there is no ether as far as we know. So we're going to cross that one off the list. And so it's not the 5 classical elements, it's 4. So in any event, still, so that just shows that philosophers throughout history have attempted to also categorize the world, the universe in sensible ways. Okay, biologists also have done this, and I don't want to belabor the point too much, but remember when you were in high school, junior high school, and you learned all those groovy biological classification systems? Many of these systems were influenced in part by the work by Carl Linnaeus, pictured in this slide. And if you're over 40, like me, you probably learned that there are 3 or 4 basic kingdoms, including animal, plant, and that funny single-celled organisms with names like Protista and Monera. Anyway, it's been a number of years since I've taken a biology course, and you may realize or may know that in fact things have changed a lot in the last 10 years or maybe in the last 5 years. So the old classification system you learned about when you were in grade school probably doesn't work anymore. So, for example, there's a great deal of debate as to whether bacteria, are they alive or not alive? There's some debate about that. I mean, they are alive in some sense, but not in the other sense. But okay, now moving closer to work as a social psychologist, and this actually is a large theme in social psychology. Categorization has both advantages and disadvantages. It undoubtedly simplifies our understanding of the world. It would be nice if the world could be divided up into 4 elements, as Aristotle suggested. It would be nice if people could be neatly categorized into a limited number of categories. And there is an essence of truth there. Objects in the world are different from one another. Fire is different from mineral. It is true, in a rough general sense, it does make sense to make distinctions between ethnicities, at least in a heuristic sense. And so they can help us in a functional sense. However, this is the point I've been making, the universe is perversely complex. It resists neat categorization. It lacks strict boundaries. And any single object, including human beings, can often belong to several different categories or not at all. Okay, I'm going to skip the next slide because I think you got it. I want to get to the core of my talk today. So really what I study in part is how people categorize human beings. Social categorization, right? Social categorization. Process by which people categorize others. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Even within that approach, you can talk about experimental social psychology, and you can talk about how people form stereotypes. You can study from the moral standpoint, and you can also study stereotypes from an anthropological, sociological standpoint. Basically, the general idea here is that as a social psychologist, I'm trying to study how people form categories of human beings and the ramifications for that process in social behavior, in social inference. And just keep in mind that when anthropologists and sociologists study it, they are often doing much the same thing, but they use somewhat different labels. Okay? Okay, one thing I've sort of learned from teaching, there's some general rule, is that after 20 minutes, people start getting tired of hearing your voice, or in my case, it might even closer to be 10 minutes. So let's just do a little exercise to break things up here just a little bit. So I want you to take a look at the slide to follow, okay, and I would like you to try to remember all of the pictures that appear on the slide to follow. Okay, so you have 5 seconds. So I'm going to show you a bunch of faces, and I want you to try to remember them as best you can. All right, so you all ready? So ready, set, go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll give you an extra second. Okay. Now, that demonstration, I've sort of led you down the garden path. You already know this is a talk about categorization, so I've sort of primed you to think this way. So even though I asked you, notice I didn't ask you to categorize, all I did was ask you to memorize the faces. Now, if I had done this experiment cold, in an actual experiment and hadn't primed you to think about categories, you would probably do much the same thing. In other words, even though I told you to memorize the faces, right, your attention would be automatically drawn to the fact that those pictures belong to different meaningful categories. Some are young, some are old, some are black, some are white, right? As it turns out, at least in the United States, people's attention tends to be automatically drawn to, and I'm going to use this term in a how this term is often used in language, race, quote unquote. The time that I've spent abroad, I mean, this is definitely constrained by culture and context. In other words, in some parts of the world, race is not a particularly salient category because, for example, where I was spending time in the Republic of Georgia, sandwiched in between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the former Soviet Union, something like 99% of the people are what we would call Caucasian or white. So in that culture, race distinctions is not that important, not as important. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, yes, of course, there are African Americans in Canada, but when you go to a large metropolitan city, say Canada, Montreal, the vast majority of those folks are what we would call white. So in Canada, the distinction tends to be more towards what we call native peoples and people, say, from French origin. My general point here is that for us, most Americans, including myself, you implicitly, in doing this without necessarily being aware of it, sort them into black and white, perhaps also young, old, right? But just keep in mind that's not necessarily universal. You might have done there are other bases of categorization. For example, some of the men are wearing ties and some of them aren't wearing ties. So you could make a near infinite number of distinctions based on categories. But for most cultures, well, many cultures, ethnicity leaps out, gender leaps out, and age leaps out. So that's one of the big three: ethnicity, age, and gender. Thank you. Okay. I basically already mentioned that, again, there's, from a strict biological perspective, there is no such thing as race, or race when people talk about the black race, white race, no such thing. But we still use that. Okay. Okay, and this is just worth saying again, we act as though they're real. That's the big point here. From a strict perspective, there is no such thing as race, but we treat it as though it's real. Right? We treat it functionally as though it's real. Arbitrary, yes. Are they arbitrary? Yes, you betcha. They say in Wisconsin, but that doesn't mean that race doesn't play a huge role in the way that people perceive and respond to people around us. So you can't come up to a person and say, no, don't use race, it's not real. It is real. People pretend as though it's real. Alas, I wish it would be nice if people didn't, but they do. They treat it as though it's real. Okay? Okay, categorization lies at the heart of all stereotyping. Just to do another little demonstration, look at these phrases. Gee, another professor with a beard. They really are all like. People from upstate New York are geeks. I am from upstate New York, Syracuse, widely known as geeky people. People from the south, north, east, west, insert your favorite category, talk funny. Young people are stupid. Old people are wise. Men are aggressive. These are things you may have heard in life. Women are more compassionate than men. Blacks have an innate sense of rhythm. Japanese people are quiet. White people can't jump. North Americans are solemn. Native Americans are solemn. British are stuffy. Most Canadians are really nice. Americans are violent and loud. And French people are obnoxious and rude. Right? Notice that these all are assertions. They may be things that you've said or perhaps thought. Right? Notice that all these are essentially categorizations. You're saying, here's a category and here's what they're like. Right? Just a couple more because, so I just highlighted, notice that, the categories, of course, are in yellow, and essentially what's going on here is people are citing or mentally referring to a category and making an attribution about the group. Essentially, by the way, just a couple notes on that. I've studied this, and this has been studied for quite a long time. When you hear people stereotype, they're pretending that the group is all alike, or they're saying, and notice that that's true for positive stereotypes. You say, all Canadians are nice, and I just have to admit that I have a positive bias towards Canadians. But notice that, even the most dedicated pro-Canadian person would have to admit, maybe, out of the millions of people in Canada, they're probably not all nice. Maybe there's somebody in Montreal that's obnoxious. So that's a general point. It's what we call assumed homogeneity. So people often treat categories as if everybody in the category is the same. Interestingly enough, there's one category we don't do that with, and that's the in-group. So Americans, for example, if an American said, oh, all Americans are alike, most Americans wouldn't say that. Most Americans would not say all Americans are alike. You would hear an American say something like, oh, all French, they're pretty much all alike. Now, if any of you have done any traveling, you will hear people over in Europe say, oh, all Americans are alike. Right? So for the perspective, from an outside perspective, we often look at outgroups. What we call outgroups is that when you don't belong to the group, there's a tendency to see them as all alike. So professors, well, they might be saying this in a joking way, but they may say, oh, students are all alike. And students might say, oh, professors are all alike. But you tend not to say that about your own group. Okay, this is, if you like, jargon, and social psychologists love jargon. It's what we call the outgroup homogeneity effect. The outgroup homogeneity effect. The tendency to see the other group as more homogeneous as it really is. Okay. So any questions at this point? Any clarifications? Overgeneralization, yes. You are taking a quality or trait, say niceness or aggressiveness, and you're saying, well, so you're absolutely right, you've met 4 or 5 members of the group, and you are then taking that small bit of data and then extrapolating, overgeneralizing it. Like I said, social psychologists have jargon for everything, so we would call it what we call exemplar to category generalizations. You meet a small number of people, 4 or 5 people, and you don't say, well, I've met 4 French people, so those 4 people are nice or obnoxious, and therefore I'm going to resist any other conclusions. No, people extrapolate. Interestingly enough, though, people tend to not do that with their in-group, probably because, by definition, you are more familiar with the members of the in-group. Right? So, yeah, so that's absolutely true. Okay, one thing that's interesting, and I've done some research on this, is that, both from a research standpoint as well as in everyday language, most people think of stereotypes as negative, and indeed they often are, but you can have positive stereotypes as well. So, sort of rooting for the home team, or in-group favoritism. And here's actually a real-life example. Just before, on September 10th, 2001, George W. Bush's approval rating was about 47%. 2 days later, George Bush's approval rating was 91%, right after the 9/11 attacks. And it wasn't just approval ratings. There was a general sense, you may remember, that at least Americans, at least for a short period of time, were what we call rally around the flag effect. There's this general sense of patriotism. You guys may remember this, the now hard to believe image of people from Democrats, Republicans gathering in the House of the steps of the Senate or House of Representatives, I guess it was the Senate, singing "God Bless America." It's hard to believe them doing that now with the fiscal cliff. But back then there was a general strong sense of patriotism immediately after the 9/11 attacks. Now, it's sort of a sad thing that it takes things like the 9/11 attacks to bring Americans together. But in any event, my general point is that patriotism is a classic example of a positive stereotype. When people said America is great, America is strong, and people started waving the American flag, that's an example of positive stereotypes. You have this aura around the in-group, right? Sense of invincibility and so on and so forth. Historically, you find that with wars, and I'm sure you just know this intuitively. When countries go to war, they tend to rally around their own leaders, around their own country. There's that sense of destiny that we're good, we're moral, we're just, right? So that's an example of positive stereotypes. And you could arguably say that historically a lot of bad things have happened. For example, hopefully not insulting anybody, the Crusades, for example, when people believe that their religion is correct, and anyone who stands in the way must be, gotten out of the way. So this idea that our religion is better than others, that's also an example of positive stereotypes. So I just mentioned that because it's good to try to avoid the simplification that says, well, if we could get just rid of negative stereotypes, we'd all be fine. Well, think about that stereotyping is often comparative. That my group is better than yours. right? So negative stereotyping often is when people are racist. For example, a white person might be racist, have negative stereotypes. Blacks, often there's two things going on. They are negative towards the out group. I don't like the other group, but they also have a sense of superiority towards their own group. They sort of go hand in hand, right? In any event, there's been some work on this. And researchers, Susan Fisk at Princeton has done a lot of work on this, and this is, no, she didn't invent this term, but she's the first to study it from a social psychological standpoint, the so-called benevolent stereotyping. So this is actually the men's stereotypes about women, and the general point that is that it's actually, technically speaking, a mixed bag, that men have both positive and negative stereotypes about women sort of at the same time. This is what we call benevolent stereotyping, sometimes called ambivalent stereotyping. So this picture on the left is this example of chivalry. So it's term related to the institution of knighthood. It's usually associated with ideals of knightly virtues, honor, and courtly love. Anyway, when we use this term in everyday parlance, we're talking about, this is sort of laughably stereotypic now, that a man's walking down the street and he lays his jacket on the puddle so the woman can walk, I guess, so she doesn't get her shoes dirty. You might just say, well, honey, just walk around the puddle. That would be perhaps easier. But in any event, this idea of benevolent stereotype, and I put benevolent in quotes because it's not really benevolent. It's a double-edged sword here. It's a double-sided. So that the idea, according to this theory, is that men often have beliefs about women, and not saying that all men have this, but in theory, a man could have this belief, that have hostile beliefs, that women are not as intelligent or competent as men. That's one aspect of it. But then there's so-called benevolent beliefs. Women should be protected and cherished by men. Now, again, don't get me wrong. There might be a man who honestly believes that women should be protected and cherished by men. And there might not be a dark side to that, negative side. But in some cases, at least, when a man thinks or says, well, we should protect women, there is a little implication that we protect them because they can't fend for themselves. That's the general idea, is that we need to protect women. Well, because maybe they're not as strong or self-reliant as women. Right? So that's the general idea here. Now, as it turns out, it's very difficult to measure this because, of course, a man is not going to come to your lab and say, yes, I have a double standard for women. It's true. I have both positive and negative beliefs. They're not going to write that down on a questionnaire. You have to probe a little bit and try to dig at it a little indirectly. And that raises another general point is stereotyping is tough to study, and I tell my students because of two words, and those two words are people lie. Right? If you bring your subjects in the laboratory and says, what's your attitudes towards African Americans? It's very rare a person says, nope, I have no negative attitudes at all. They're all positive. Somebody said that in my lab, I would just say, well, probably negative. So you have to try to figure out to get beyond what, again, as I mentioned, we have jargon for everything. It's what we call social desirability biases. People want to present themselves as fair, reasonable, without bias. And that definitely applies to social surveys and any work. Well, not any work, but people want to present themselves as fair, just, bereft, or without bias. Just interesting to look to see what people say about their own negative stereotypes. So in our culture, we're trained to not judge a book by its cover, and we're generally discouraged to hold stereotypes about others. But what happens if you ask people directly? Right? So you don't beat around the bush, you just get right at the heart of the matter is that, say, is it appropriate? Is it okay to have these negative stereotypes? And a very interesting study was done a while back by Chris Crandall. And since it's been about 20 minutes, time for another little demonstration, I think. All right. So the general point here is, what happens if you ask people? It says, well, do you think this stereotype is appropriate? Right? And so this is an interesting little study. So just a little background here. These were undergraduates at Kansas, University of Kansas. This becomes important in a second. They're presented with a series of groups, and for each one, they were simply asked a very simple question. Is it okay to feel negatively towards this group or not? And it was a very simple rating scale. 0 means, no, it's not okay. Not okay to feel negative. 1 is, well, maybe it's okay to feel negative towards this group. And 2, yes, it is okay to feel negative towards this group. So just keep that in mind. Lower numbers mean, say, no, it's not appropriate. And 2 is, well, maybe it's okay to feel negative. This was done anonymously to help people be at least somewhat more honest. So let's see what people say. So again, closer it is to 0, the more people are saying, no, it's not appropriate. Closer it is to 2, people saying, yeah, it could be appropriate. Blind people, deaf people, mentally retarded people, members of a bowling league. So these are all pretty much, people say, no, you should not hold negative views towards these groups. Black Americans, Jews, and these are the terms he used in his study. So Hispanics, Asian Americans, Canadians. So now we're actually drifting a little higher here. It's still pretty low. It's pretty close to 0, but they're getting a little higher. Ugly people, cat owners, high school cheerleaders, people with AIDS, right? Fat people. Incidentally, Chris Crandall does work with people who are obese, and sometimes there are certain segments of the population they prefer to not be called obese, they prefer to be called fat. So, rap music fans, traveling salesmen, Hare Krishnas. So it's getting a little higher. It's getting a little closer. Well, maybe it's okay to have negative views towards this group. People like country music, lawyers, gay soldiers, people call the psychic hotline, welfare recipients, right? So now notice that we are getting closer to 1.0. So, well, feminists, gamblers, people go to Kansas State University. Keep them, these are University of Kansas, right? So, well, if you don't like the group, that's maybe okay. It's people who smell bad, porn stars, ex-convicts, people who cut in line, and this is back in the day when people would have to wait in line for registration. These days, you just click on a mouse. But when I was in college, I had nightmarish images of basically hundreds of people in line to register. But anyway, so students hate it when people cut in line. They don't like it. Most of us don't like it either. People litter, female prostitutes, people cheat on exams. So that's a classic one. Most students are honest. So when they come across fellow students who cheat, they don't like that. And they say, I don't like it, I don't like that group, and they have no bones about it. People cheat on their spouses, drunk drivers, wife beaters, and rapists. And so here's the little quiz for today. So I've just shown you an array of categories that range from relatively low, well, I'm sure you can remember, so sort of range from categories such as African Americans, blind people, all the way to rapists, and people basically saying, if you belong to that category, I hate you and I have no compunction about it, right? So, but just in general, what is the underlying variable that anybody determines whether these groups are being ranked closer to 0 or to 2? Anybody? Yeah. Yes, so it's personal responsibility, or to be more accurate, perceived responsibility. It's perceived responsibility. So the idea, at least for the low ones, see the ones that were ranked relatively low. You can see that, for example, you're not become blind by choice, right? It's not something you decide. You don't choose your ethnic category. Yes, there are people who will try to alter their perceived ethnicity, but for the most part, you don't choose that. Interestingly enough, and there's some research on this, that people who are overweight or fat or obese, however you want to put it, research shows that when you see a person who's, say, 400 or 500 pounds, and you attribute their weight to something overeating, you could probably have guessed how this plays out. When people perceive that this is caused by overeating, you tend to be more negative towards that person. If you infer that this is actually due to, say, some types of diabetes or something you have no control over, then that tends to mitigate or ameliorate the negativity. So the underlying point here, it's perceived responsibility.
How do you explain this bowling league?
Yes. Well, that's what we would conveniently call a burp in the data. Or as my advisor says, well, we can't explain everything. So admittedly, there's some randomness here, and it's if you collected data on perceived responsibility, it would be a strong correlation, but it wouldn't be 1.0. It would be, as far as the bowling league, I don't know, maybe students like bowlers, I don't know. But admittedly, that one doesn't fit so well. But by and large, perceived responsibility certainly explains the ends. Yeah.
The 13 is particularly interesting, remembering the initial wave of AIDS and the religious response to that.
Yes.
They were immediately defined as they did have control over
Right.
that behavior, and therefore we should not be.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say this is a nice example. This is contextually constrained. These are college students, and even back then, the general perception among college students, they would say, well, people have AIDS, it's not their fault, it's not their responsibility. And as you're alluding to, back then, and certainly now, there's a segment of the population would say, no, I dislike that group because it's a choice. In other words, the attribution that people are making is this is a category they've placed themselves into. Right? Now, again, this is where perception is reigns supreme here. In other words, whether it was really their responsibility or not, sort of besides the point, is how it's perceived. Negativity towards homosexual, gays, and lesbians, same thing, is that people say, well, people would tend to be more negative, say, well, you've chosen this lifestyle and you derogate them. Others would say, well, it's not their choice. But anyway, it's the perceived responsibility, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, that's a great point. So it's not only person responsibility. It's probably people saying, well, would I do that? That could possibly explain the bowling league, maybe everyday activity. So in fact, you're almost certainly correct. It's probably personal responsibility, and also people implicitly thinking, well, would I do that myself or not? Okay, I'll take one more question. Yeah. Yes, personal experience. I mean, have they had any contact with the members of the group? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we can expand this to 3 factors for sure. But yeah, so it's personal experience. Have you had any experience with? So maybe if people have contact with people who call the psychic hotline, and it's easier to have a stereotype about a group if you've never met them before. So so absolutely, that's undoubtedly true. So personal responsibility, also contact with the group would certainly play a role there. Okay, I want to sort of shift gears here. I have about 15 minutes or so. I definitely want to leave room for questions. Now, one thing that's really interesting and important is, and so far I've made the general point that people will latch onto categories, right, and they will form stereotypic beliefs about those categories. The question is, well, you might say, well, gee, categories, that's a big word. What kind of categories? What kind of categories would you be meaning? So as it turns out, yes, you can have stereotypes about a lot of things in principle. You could have stereotypes about people who wear glasses. You could have stereotypes about people who wear black shoes. You could have stereotypes in principle about almost anything. So that's true in a literal sense. But in a functional sense, scholars, sociologists, historians, psychologists generally agree that there are a limited number of categories or dimensions that seem to be associated with categories or stereotypes that are most harmful and powerful. So the point is that, yes, on a literal level, you could have an infinite number of stereotypes for any given category, right? But it isn't infinite in a realistic sense. Turns out there's at least 6, or they're sometimes called the Big 6, in terms of what people latch on to. Incidentally, there's some disagreements here. If I have a colleague at New York University who would probably burst in and says, no, it's not 6, it's 5. So there's some disagreement here. Biological sex. So this is relating to one of the first slides I presented. So by and large, we tend to have a general set to notice sex or gender. We notice. So just as a little parlor exercise, try sometime today, if you go to a coffee house, a restaurant, or go home, try not noticing a person's gender. Try to not see whether they're male or female, right? It's hard. It's difficult. Maybe not impossible, but usually automatically notice whether they're male or female. Now, if they happen to be rather gender ambiguous, you might have some hard time figuring out, right? But the point is that you will tend to notice that. If it's there's something there. Race or ethnicity, again, try meeting a person and try not noticing their ethnicity. It's hard, at least in our culture. Now, of course, just to back up, our world would probably be a better place if indeed we were perceptually blind to race or ethnicity, if we never noticed whether a person were black or white. It would be nice if human beings could do that, but from a perceptual standpoint, probably unlikely, not impossible, but now, well, I'll come back. What was that? It would be uninteresting. It would be interesting, maybe boring, but perhaps there would be a world, possibly would be a better place. I should mention, by the way, there's an important exception to this. If you've had a colleague or coworker, you've known this person for years and years, in that case, yes, you may cease to see them as African American or Hispanic. So that's an important exception. It's not as though you meet somebody and you always see them primarily as one race or another. I'm talking about when you meet somebody for the first time. Okay, that's the general idea. Okay, age. Try meeting somebody and not noticing that they are their age. Seeing a person, you have a baby who's 2 months old versus somebody who's 50, and sort of not noticing their difference in age. It's tough. Religion. Incidentally, I should mention that the first three, of course, have visual markers, biological sex, race, ethnicity, and age. There are visual markers that tell us what people belong to. Religion is an interesting one because, of course, now some people, it is true, for example, I am Jewish, and it is true that when you look at somebody who's Jewish, they might, quote unquote, look Jewish, but that's not because of religion per se. It's because of Mediterranean background and certain features of your hair and so forth. So with some taking kind of a grain of salt here, people can say, well, I can tell what religion they belong to, and they might be right, they might not be right. In any event, our point is that people want to categorize with respect to religion. And it's not like gender where you can say, oh, of course they're male or female, but we want to tell or be able to discern what religion they belong to. Sexual preference and nationality. So I'm just mentioning this as Big Six. Again, some colleagues and psychologists might disagree in this, but if you look across the broad spectrum, if you look at the history of stereotyping, discrimination in all parts of the world, right, they usually center on at least one of those six. Okay? You usually don't have wars and battles over the glasses wearers versus the non-glasses wearers. They usually settle around these. So of course, that raises the question, why those six? Why those six in particular? And that's sort of another story. In general, there's lots of theories. You might say, well, people pay attention to things that are visually obvious. That could explain some of it, but that wouldn't explain, for example, why a lot of wars are fought over religion, right? Or that there's a lot of conflict over sexual preference. So we can talk about this after I finish or after I'm concluded, but that's actually a hot topic now in social psychology. Why those six? Why why isn't there a seventh? Right? So it's an interesting issue, especially when you get you could say, well, okay, yes, there's evolutionary reasons why you pay attention to whether somebody's male or female. Yes. You might say, well, in the case of race or ethnicity, you say, well, of course people notice because it's in their face, literally. And then age, you might say, well, of course people can tell the difference between a baby and somebody who's 50. But then it's this idea of I'm trying to take the of course out of it. You might say, well, why religion? Why is that used as a basis for categorization? Okay. Let's see. I'm going to call an audible here and do a little bit of, okay. So we can all agree that, that stereotyping and prejudice are things that we would like to have less of, right, from a practical standpoint. So taking off my pointy academic hat, say, look, from a general standpoint, stereotyping and prejudice is a social problem. It's a problem. It's a problem in most cultures, and certainly a problem in the United States historically. So the question is, as a social scientist, that's from a practical standpoint, we're interested in, well, how can we ameliorate the problem, right? So, or as one of my colleagues in other areas said, in a not unkindly way, said something to the effect of, well, if you're so smart, tell us how you can make stereotyping go away. Right? It's a good question. Maybe we're not so smart. In any event, I just want to make sure that you highlight a couple issues here. It's very easy to say, well, people who are stereotypic are stupid. They're just stupid. They're dumb. If we can just get them smart, then they wouldn't do it. It would be easier if that's true, right? That would just mean we can give people more information. We can have them meet members of the category and inform them. But that's not true, alas. Stereotyping cannot simply be reduced to, well, stupid people are stereotypic or prejudiced, and smart people are not, or reasonable. So it's not that easy. The problem is, and social psychologists certainly didn't invent this idea, stereotyping prejudice often is rooted, at least in part, in desire for resource and power. Human beings like to have power resources, especially men. And oftentimes when you have conflicts between group X and group Y, historically, culturally, it's because one group likes position of power. They like the wealth, and they're reluctant to give it up. Right? That's probably not going to go away. There's lots of biological evolutionary reasons, again, hearkening back to Conrad Lorenz, Darwin, other people, is that, other species show this as well, mammalian species, that we like to have power and control and to mean overvalued resources. And unfortunately, that often gives rise to conflict. Now, there's another, and this is sort of my pessimistic side coming through, so as I tell my students, I'm a realistic pessimist, I suppose. But another problem with prejudice is that it's often unconscious, right? So when people come into my lab or people say in surveys, they say, well, no, I'm not prejudiced. Now, let's assume for the moment they're being honest, right? They're honestly saying, no, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not stereotypic. They might be telling the truth as far as they can tell. The problem is that a lot of stereotyping and prejudice is unconscious. Now, I don't mean unconscious in a Freudian sense. I mean that it's subtle, or it's sort of below the level of awareness. Right? It's not deep-seated, unresolved issues of the id. We're talking about more sort of the subtle, under the radar, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What time is it? Enough, okay. Another problem, sort of maybe to be less pessimistic, let's call this a challenge. So let's frame this positive as my clinical friends. Let's reframe this as in a little more positive. So here's a challenge. One problem is, or challenge, is that stereotyping can often be, although not always, linked to be very visual or salient cues. So when you meet a person for the first time, it's hard to not notice that they belong to a different race or ethnicity. So that's a challenge, right? So in principle, if we could, quote, not see the fact that they belong to a different ethnicity, that would be a first start, but that's tough. It's hard to not notice. And here's, this is another challenge. Interestingly enough, work by Dan Wegner at Harvard and other people have shown that, interestingly enough, and ironically, when you tell people don't be stereotypic, you give them warnings or say, okay, we're not going to be experiment, and I'm exaggerating, but just slightly tell a student or tell your participants, whatever you do, don't be stereotypic, don't be racist. Right? So it turns out that actually makes it worse. So my grandfather used to play this game. He would just, at dinner, he would say, okay, now for the next 10 minutes, don't think of a purple cow. Right? Don't think of a purple cow. And of course, for the next 10 minutes, all you can think about is a purple cow. Because every time it sort of drifts into your, what we call working memory, you say, oh wait, I'm not supposed to think about that. So it's this idea that if you keep on saying, okay, don't be racist, don't notice they're black, don't think about that black stereotype, or about gender, or about Hispanics. The idea is what we call an ironic effect of suppression. So if you keep on thinking to yourself, oh, don't think about X, whatever you do, don't do that, it ironically makes X, and X could be a belief, it could be whatever, more accessible. And the old joke, sort of hackney joke, is that you go to a cocktail party and you know this juicy piece of gossip, and your wife, your spouse says, no, whatever you do, don't say that about your colleague. Don't say anything about the divorce. And you're saying, don't say that, don't say that. Then you maybe had a couple drinks, and then you blurt out, say, so how's the divorce, or something like that. So I'm exaggerating here slightly, but the idea is that if you are mentally rehearsing this idea of don't be stereotypic, it has a boomerang or an ironic effect. Incidentally, you get this on more subtle cases where you give participants, warnings, or not warnings. They say it's important that you be accurate and unbiased. And essentially what people are then doing, they're using that as a cue that they shouldn't use racial stereotypes, and they end up being even more. Right? So, incidentally, this has some practical implications for lawyer or the judicial system. If you are a lawyer, you want to implicitly probably remind the members of the jury that they should not be paying attention to the defendant's race, and you can say that in tricky ways. But of course, if you say that and they sort of get it, but of course they try to mentally rehearse, oh, don't pay attention to the race, it could make it worse. So here's another challenge, is that exceptions are often subcategorized. And this is a famous example. Somebody did a study with gender stereotypes, and they were studying a group of rock climbers. They're all guys, and they were saying, the guys were saying, oh, women can't be rock climbers. And it turns out if you're a rock climber, if you have sons or daughters that do that, turns out actually women are very good rock climbers because they have the better physiological, they tend to be smaller, a little lighter. And the research says, well, actually, here's this world-class rock climber, and the man says, oh, well, she's not really a woman. So what they do is that they what we call subcategorize. And that actually is, there's research on this as well as Barack Obama, right? Very successful African-American. Now, it turns out he's multiracial, but he self-identifies, or at least he's often seen as African-American. What people often do is that they set him aside as an exception, right? So essentially, they wouldn't say this consciously. They might say, well, yes, there are African-Americans who are successful in politics, but they set that aside as an exception, right? And then they retain their category, and it remains intact. And people don't say this anymore, but when people say, well, some of my best friends are fill in the blank, right? Well, often they have their favorable attitudes towards the people they're familiar with, but then they still retain that negative category as a whole. So one thing that people are deviously, perversely flexible. So someone might generally believe, oh yes, I have a positive belief towards Barack Obama. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to affect their overall beliefs about people of color in general. They're set aside as an exception. That's why you can often find people who are really racist, right? But they might generally have some friends who are African American. And by the way, I keep on saying African American. It's not just black, white. It could be Hispanics. It could be anything. But that sort of explains it. People set aside these as subcategories or exceptions, even though they might be generally stereotypic. So another challenge, you bring people in the laboratory, and you might have some seemingly effective, you could have a workshop on race relations, and then at the end of 2 hours, people might generally seem to be less prejudiced, and the problem is, well, I would, that's all well and good, but I would want to know 6 months after they've done your workshop, are they less prejudiced? You also have the problem of preaching to the choir. If I had a workshop on, combating racism in our society, probably members of the Ku Klux Klan are not going to come to my workshop. The people that come to the workshop are probably already people who are already on board, right, to combat racism. So it's sort of preaching to the choir effect here. Okay. Okay. Now, I don't want to end on or conclude on too much of a bummer of a note. Some things that we know may work sometimes. What we call self-regulation or self-monitoring. So indeed this does work if you give people instructions to sort of pay attention to what they're doing, in essence. Right? Don't go on automatic pilot, sort of what we call self-regulate. Basically you're trying to get people to catch themselves, self-monitor, self-regulate, slow down, right? Now, early childhood training, when I see this, I'm not talking about potty training, I'm talking about it is true that if you have parents who are relatively unbiased or in appropriate ways are trying to tell you or educate you or let you know that race doesn't matter. So the old stereotype, it's true in this case that yes, parents, early exposure to parents, caregivers that are helping you learn these lessons, yes, that can certainly make a difference. Intergroup contact, a couple of people were mentioned. Yes, if you familiarize yourself with the members of the category, if you grow up in a culture in which you're meeting lots of members of this group, that can help for sure. The problem is that can often backfire. So in large metropolitan areas, say Miami, New York, San Francisco, it's pretty diverse, right? Lots of people from different groups interacting with one another. The problem, you probably can see this, is that in large metropolitan areas, jobs are scarce, land is scarce, or there's scarce resources, and if you cram a lot of people in a small space, right? This is sort of human nature. There's going to be competition, right? And so the problem is that this is called the old intergroup conflict theory, is that, well, you can encourage people to interact with one another, but sometimes it can backfire because it might be conflict, might erupt. And reasonable people can disagree on this, but for example, in Boston and other areas where we have the forced busing, right? And the idea, I mean, I'm simplifying a great deal here, but the idea is that part of the goal was, well, if you can have black and white and people of different ethnicities interacting with one another, maybe that would reduce prejudice. Well, unfortunately, it can sometimes backfire because people, if they feel like they're being forced to interact, people may not work. Sometimes it can, oftentimes it doesn't. Conditioning exercises. There is some research suggesting that in some sense, if you condition people, if you're associating, positivity with this dislike group, so you're essentially going through quasi-clinical training or conditioning exercises, and I can talk about that a little bit later. Okay, I want to conclude in about 3 or 4 minutes. So I just want to just going to cut up a couple slides here. But one thing I've learned is one thing that students do not like. If you say, I'm going to be done in 2 minutes, and you go on for another 20 minutes. They really hate that. So I promise. It's 1:04 now, and I hope to be done in 5 minutes. Let me just, I can come back to this slide a little bit. So pretend you're not looking at this. So. Okay, what I basically want to talk about is, so it's this newer approach to measuring stereotyping. It's called the implicit approach. And the slide that I skipped over, essentially the punchline is, if you ask people in questionnaires, on standard questionnaires, what is your attitude towards gays and lesbians? What's your attitude towards Hispanics? What's your attitude towards women? Sometimes people might be truthful, but you can't count on it. You can't count on it, right? So, and long story short, if someone says something positive about the group, it may be indicative of a positive attitude towards the group, but it might be just simply that they're lying, social desirability. Okay. So what do you do? Well, this is the hot topic now, hot edge research in social psychology. This is called implicit measures. So the general idea is this, that unlike conventional or explicit measures, participants are actually not asked directly what you're really interested in. So we're being a little devious, or well, not a little, quite devious or tricky. So we're not actually asking them directly, and this is one of those ideas, I certainly didn't invent this, I wish I had, but like all good ideas, it's actually both rather elegant and simple. It's simple and elegant. It's based on pure associative learning. So for example, if I say the phrase peanut butter, right, the phrase jelly might come to mind because we hear peanut butter and jelly paired. Associative learning, right? Dogs and cats, right? Or a particular dog might come to mind. So if I just say the word dog, right, something is going to come to mind simply because you're associating those in memory. Just sort of Psych 100. Doctors, nurses, doctors, hospitals, doctors fraudulent, depending on your view. So, or pictures. I could show you a picture and show you a cute baby seal that might sort of elicit sort of this feeling of, oh, isn't that cute, or positive, or endangered, things like that. And if I show you a picture of a snake, it will trigger off negative associations. Now, importantly, I could test these associations through a variety of ways. I don't have to ask you, oh, on a scale from 0 to 10, what's your attitude towards snakes? You can measure that automatic association towards snakes without actually having to measure that explicitly. So, key point, as I see I have just a couple minutes left, he says nervously, is that you can also have associations with race or with ethnicity. So here you have a well-dressed white individual, and you can measure automatized emotional reactions, which might be positive or negative. Okay, you can present, literally this is how we do this in the laboratory. You present a picture of somebody on the computer screen, and I can explain this during the question and answer, but you can measure by a variety of different cognitive approaches, you can measure whether that mere exposure to that particular photograph automatically elicits a positive reaction. And you can do that too with you would pair that in a controlled experiment with another picture. So this is the last slide for today, so I'm just going to give you a concrete example to make this a little less abstract. So conventional approach towards measuring attitude towards the elderly, I'd say, what's your general attitude towards this person? And you would present that, say, from 0, not at all nice, to 10, extremely nice. Now, why did I pick that picture? You might say that's sort of an unflattering portrait of an elderly person. In this particular case, I sort of chose that because most undergraduates would say 9 or 10 because they don't want to appear prejudiced against an elderly person. But here's the general idea is that what you do is you literally present people with a picture and you flash it on the screen for a short amount of time, like that. Then you follow that with a question. And it's a very simple question. You say, you present people with the word nice. And all the subjects do is you say, tell us whether nice is a good word or a bad word. That's it. Okay, and there's a lot of instructions. The subjects will say, well, just that's all? Just say yes. And you have people press a particular button, and you're measuring the speed with which they say nice is a good word or a bad word. The basic punchline is that, you might have another trial, is that if people have this underlying negative association with elderly people, or at least this elderly person, they would be faster to say that mean is a bad word, if you follow. In other words, the mere presentation of the photograph is eliciting bad or negative associations, so linguists would say it's activating all these words and concepts and feelings that are negative, so they'd be faster to say that mean is a bad word. Now, I'm just choosing this as an example, and I'll end here, but just to keep in mind, the general point is that if you ask people explicitly, right, what is your attitude towards this person? It could be a black person, it could be a woman, it could be anything. You can't really trust what people say in the questionnaire, so we have to come up with sort of complex and a bit of indirect ways of measuring these, and I probably didn't do a very good job of explaining these associative tests, but the general punchline is you want to measure the stereotypes without actually saying that you're measuring the stereotype. You want to do it in sort of a backdoor approach. Okay, I've already run longer than I said I would, so let me just say thank you and open it up here for any questions that you might have. So. Yeah. Yes. Yes, great question. So, and by the way, if people need to leave, please by all means do so. Some of my colleagues would take me to task for using those interchangeably. I myself have never found that distinction between stereotyping and prejudice to be incredibly important. Those who do find it important would say that stereotypes are beliefs, right, and then would say prejudice are feelings. So if I say that Hispanics or if I say that group X is poor or is unintelligent, or whatever that group is, they would say, well, that's a stereotype, and then if you have prejudice, that would be feelings of negativity. I've sort of never found that distinction to be incredibly important because those things tend to go together. In other words, if I have very negative thoughts about the group, I also tend to have feelings. That said, one could make distinctions, but one is more pejorative than the other. And then I probably should know better. I use the word bias. Strictly speaking, bias implies accuracy. In other words, that you are biased towards group X as opposed to being accurate. Strictly speaking, bias is strictly speaking, use of the word bias implies that there's a universal standard for accuracy. In social, psychological context, that's rarely true. So, so I probably, strictly speaking, probably best to stay away from bias because that implies there's an accurate versus an inaccurate. But so we're talking about relativity of stereotyping and prejudice. So, but that's a very, very good point. So, yeah.
I had an interesting conversation with a friend of Phoenix who has raised a child she rescued from the state and was equated with the mother who gave birth to this baby in the prison. And so we had a rough beginning.
The child.
The child. And so she was like the cute puppy. And as he has grown older, he has shifted categories and is more like the uncertainty about the dog. And his experience in profiling didn't happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to repeat.
Changed her attitude.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
She really had to rethink what she
Yeah, that's a great point. In other words, if I may just slightly broaden that point out, is that perceivers, say a person who's white may look at babies who are of color or not of color. Maybe when we look at children, infants, maybe as a functional perspective, we do categorize. Maybe we do it a little less at that point. But as we get older, there in certain contexts, people might be more likely to use categorization depending on the context in which they're the person being perceived. Now, we would say social psychology, there's some confounds there that it's possible that as people get older, they're more easily ratifiably identified as being, quote, white or black. That's another issue. But your larger point is that context matters. So, for example, to stray away from the example of race. So in airports, of course, baggage screeners, in essence, are, if we want to get to it, they're looking for dangerous versus non-dangerous travelers, right? And they're hypersensitive to cues of that. And of course, we all are in post 9/11, right? I mean, not that wasn't on our mind before 9/11, but it's especially now. So, but yes, but your larger point is that when you raise a child who belongs to a different ethnicity or race, as that child gets older, the child is going to, or the person is now going to be subjected to potentially more stereotype, more categorization, depending on the context in which that person is. So. Incidentally, African American men tend to be more subject to profiling, say when they're driving, compared to African American women, because of the perception that they are more dangerous. And so it's not just a black-white thing. It's gender also plays a role as well. Yes.
In other countries where dark skin individuals stay in South America,
Mm-hmm.
like dark skin, or they go to some other countries where there's dark skin people, light skin people, what I call the slave house syndrome.
The what house? The
Slave house syndrome.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Where they discriminate against each other, even in the same race. Same thing in Iraq.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Interesting. So, so two great points there. One is that even members within their own group, oppressed minority groups, are still paying attention to skin tone in other cultures, and I think this is true. For example, in certain parts of South America, regardless of whether you're focusing on members of your own group, there's a general push to have lighter skin. Lighter skin is seen as more advantageous or better. And then the second thing you're saying is that, and it's absolutely true, is that, of course, what is white? I mean, my skin isn't really white. It's sort of peach or something. I don't know. But so depending on the part of the world you're in, some of you may go to a particular culture, and people may not know what you are. Right, and you mentioned if you cover up your hair, they might say, "Oh, he's a member of X or member of Y." So it's, yeah. So that often. So that's actually just reinforces something I said. The beginning is that we have a strong push to categorize, even though, of course, the world cannot necessarily be neatly categorized. Right. So as you know, and to make it less abstract and more personal. That often happens when people, I've actually had friends, her father is Asian, her mother is non-Asian, people will literally come up to her in a bar and say, "What are you?" And she'll say, "Amy." I'm Amy. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a very excellent point, is that stereotyping, if you think about these as the great journalist Walter Lippmann talked about this as sort of rigid categories, rigid beliefs. And certainly, yes, we have stereotypic beliefs about the self. And certainly you could look at this as, clinical psychologists, if you think about this. What clinical psychologists are trying to do is to change people's categorization of the self. So somebody comes in and says, "I'm no good." Right? Or alternatively, a narcissist might say, "Everybody loves me," right? And so the clinician might gently try to convince them, so, well, many people like you, but not everybody. But also this idea of self-deception, right? So people say, "Well, I'm always a great driver. I never get drunk." And on that count, I mean, it's a funny type of stereotype, but it is a stereotype. People have a general subjective sense when they've had a couple drinks that they're still good drivers, but there's tons of research on this. It turns out people are very bad calibrators, that they're not very good at detecting the deficits in reaction time. When you've had a couple drinks, when one's had a couple drinks, it tends to impair your driving, but the key point is that people don't really realize how much it's affecting them. But the larger point is that, yeah, if we all walk around placing ourselves, the self, in various categories, some of those categories, belief categories, might be accurate, but sometimes they're not. But the general point is we love our categories. Once we're placed in, especially positive ones, we're resistant to being miscategorized or categorized differently. Way in the back there, yeah.
I'm just wondering, with the pictures and all that, if you have any shift towards like the different races or whatever, and the clothing on the waist of them, is that changes, because I'm thinking that I would be categorized dangerous versus not dangerous by the way somebody is dressed and the way they appear, or by their clothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also a great question. These are all really nice questions. And there's been indeed some studies on that. And essentially what they'll do, in my slide, I presented some pictures of well-dressed African-American. And then what you just do a controlled study. So you prime people with, say, a person of color who is dressed well versus, say, in a jogging suit. And essentially you get what you'd expect, is that on these sort of automatic priming studies or even more conventional studies, people have more favorable judgments if they're more well-dressed than if they're not. The problem, and this research ran into a challenge, is that essentially the conclusion is everything else being equal, people tend to respond more favorably towards well-dressed people. But it doesn't really affect the underlying core negativity or prejudice towards the ethnic group. In other words, people responding to the person's dress, not to their ethnicity. So, if you meet a person, if a person's racist and they met an exceptionally talented, well-dressed African-American and they respond favorably, basically what the research suggests is, yes, they're responding relatively favorably, but to the way they're dressed. And their sort of core negativity towards the group, the ethnic group, is staying intact, unfortunately. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the research does show, yes, there is some contextual variation that but the research suggests that people, will pay attention to other things temporarily, but they'll then slide back down to race. So, yeah.
Our son is now 15, and he's been very successful in his career as an electrical engineer. But in his youth, in his post-degree years, he decided to let his hair grow all the way down to his butt. And it was beautiful hair. He was blessed with wavy, beautiful hair. And he was interviewing for a new job. And, of course, we couldn't influence him as parents. But his sister said to him, "Now, you're never going to know if you didn't get this job because you weren't the right person or because of your hair."
Right.
We cut his hair.
And he got the job.
No, we didn't.
Oh, didn't get the job. So now we knew. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so interesting. So it's, yeah. You've been, wait, yeah. Women. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm. You mean in terms of relations between China and the United States as... Yeah. 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 I mean, I think you're saying several interesting things. One is that well, in the United States and apparently in China, that over the years, women have been becoming, there's certainly still virulent, strong gender bias, but economically things are at least somewhat better now than they were, say, 50 years ago. The question is, how will that affect, say, men's stereotypes towards women? Will they continue to see them as part of this sort of benevolent, hostile stereotype, or will then men start to become, change their attitude towards women? Will men as a whole, capital N, capital M, be resistant to the idea of the changing power dynamics? For example, I mean, it's not an original idea. Some companies in the United States are traditionally male-dominated, and as women graduate with higher degrees with greater frequency, are these corporations going to be flexible? Right? So, for example, I mean, some law firms are more traditional than the men usually have power. Other law firms are beginning to let women be more in ascendancy. But you're also saying, of course, a person might say, well, our corporation is completely free of all bias towards women. Say, look, half of our lawyers are women. And that might be true statistically, but of course, again, there's that, you have to ask, well, is it really true, or are the people, it's a self-delusion or self-deception, or sort of depends on how you measure bias. But I don't know if that answered your question or not, but certainly, admittedly, I probably emphasized issues of race maybe too much, but of course, many of these issues apply equally well to gender, for sure. Absolutely. So yeah, did that answer your question, or maybe not? So, some of it, okay. So, yeah, so it's like the beast, it's the elephant, yes. Yes, way in the back. Yeah, so the profiling, right? And so he says nervously. So yes, I mean, it's one of those things that if you are a police officer and if you see a guy who's 6'8", has knives in both hands, and is saying, I'm looking to kill somebody, he hasn't done anything yet, is it reasonable to assume that person is a threat to society? Yeah, probably, or maybe. If in terms of profiling, on average, men commit more aggressive crime, acts of aggression than women. So, on the average, you would be more likely statistically to be, in other words, men are more likely to commit crimes of aggression than women. So, should you use gender as a basis of calculation? Yes, in some sense. Does that mean that women are never murderers or commit assault and battery? Obviously not, but. In any event, it's one of those things that, for example, when you go to the airport and they're screening for people who are terrorists versus non-terrorists. I mean, again, on the average, men are more likely to be terrorists, but of course terrorists are smart now, and they will then have a woman go through, apparently have a woman try and have a bomb strapped on her because they know that the screeners are looking more for men. But in any event, I mean, it's a tricky issue because in case of gender, right, say, well, maybe they should be profiling because gender is it's not a perfect predictor, but it has some predictive validity. And this is one of the things that get really tricky, depending on the demographic area in your area. It might be that whites are more likely to commit crimes in that particular context. It might be that other contexts it might be the reverse. But now, of course, we're in an issue of none of this, of course, is perfectly predictive of violent actions. And it's you could have a false alarm. Of course, if you stop somebody and they haven't committed a crime, of course, you've now violated their civil liberties, right? So I think last week we had a lawyer speak to the group, and so it's a tricky issue. I'm sort of just being deliberately cautious here because there are trade-offs, and yes, if you wanted to define profiling as accurate, looking for accurate categorization, put it that way, say yes under certain circumstances, but we're not in psychology experiments anymore. Here we're talking about stopping people, right, and saying, we've stopped you, sir, because we think that you're likely to commit a crime, and if it turns out that you're mistaken, you now have a lawsuit on your hands, and you have issues of civil liberty. So it's obviously a lot more complex than the safe havens of the laboratory. Okay, I think we have a couple more minutes, so if somebody's had their hand up for a while, yeah. Yeah. Well, interesting. So members within the family, some would pull themselves up by their bootstraps faster than others. And yeah, I mean, that's, when you see somebody be successful, other things being equal, there's this tendency, well, John was successful. Frank, why aren't you as successful? Why didn't you succeed as fast? And that's a great point because you have that on a more of a macro level. So if my parents, grandparents grew up in Brooklyn and the Bronx and in the 20s, 30s, the teens, 20s, and 30s. And just because of historical, other random reasons that you find, for example, if you compare the Irish and the Germans and other ethnic or religious groups, that people are saying, well, group X is doing better. Why isn't the other group doing as better? So people are quick to make sort of attributions about talent, skill, and perseverance, but as you mentioned, that can also happen on a more micro level, even within a family. Absolutely. So, yeah, they can last forever. Yes. One last question, or okay? Yes.
After the capture in 9/11, then coming out who had caused the problem, anybody with a
Yeah.
suffering a lot. Even though people who were born in the church were before they were suffering a great deal. Eventually, things came back to more peaceful.
Eventually, yeah.
As it became more comfortable with security.
Well, I guess the quick answer is this idea that right after 9/11, anyone whose skin was exaggerating here slightly, but Pakistanians and people from even Israel or whatever. I mean, if your skin was a little more swarthy, all right, you'd be stopped as a potential. But that eventually went away, and I guess the general feeling is threat. Threat tends to be an important driving force of stereotyping prejudice. So immediately after 9/11, threat was more salient, and that tended to exacerbate stereotyping. The threat is a little bit less now, and then things have been calming down here a little bit. But there's lots of research when you experimentally prime threat that tends to exacerbate in-group, out-group conflict, and that's probably one part of what's going on. There were probably other things as well. Yeah, probably that would be one part of the story, I would say. But, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. You've been a kind audience, and thanks again. Oh, pardon. Oh, did you wear a coin? Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. That.
One little question for you. Race